thank you very much for being part of the symposium. And of course, because taking out time and you're sharing your insights with us. So thank you very much. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to make life easy for you. You will have to tell us about the symposium. And say, give me 1 minute. I don't know what you're seeing. Are you seeing this screen? Let me put up the one that I want you to talk about. And then you can talk. Then you're going to talk about yourself, and it's going to be after that your show. If you want to bring me in at any point of time, totally your wish. You don't want to bring me in, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
But that whole reason for talking about the symposium, I'll tell you the reason behind it. I have spoken about it. But first, please, Alicia, please tell us about the symposium.
Yeah, so I can see it on my screen now. So, we're spending a couple of weeks here talking about Indigenous peoples and mediation and approaches to mediation. And it's pretty incredible to have an opportunity to shine a spotlight on an area of conversation that isn't necessarily highlighted within purist mediation training, purist mediation theory, and often dispute resolution practices. And, Indigenous peoples have been mediating or facilitating processes forever. And there is so much that we can learn from how they engage in peace building. And, it just expands to the lens which we all use and expands our practice, which I'll talk about how it's impacted my own practice. And there's so much heart in the work that we can learn from. So it's amazing to hear from people from across the globe talk about themselves as Indigenous people and the work that they do, and or non-Indigenous people and what they have learned. So thank you for putting the symposium together.
Thank you for giving such a nice introduction to the symposium. I would not have been able to do that. So, but of course, all the episodes, all the sessions are available on my YouTube channel, and links are available on mediatorvikram.com. There's a schedule which is available with all the YouTube links. So that's what it is, Alicia. Now it's your show. Please, about yourself, and take it forward however you want to.
Thank you so much, Vikram. So my name is Alicia Kuin, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for welcoming me to share my experiences and insights and what I've learned about this topic. So I've been mediating for 15 or so years now, and I've mediated in all different areas, starting off in the area of commercial practice and then expanding into international work. So I spent time working on a legal defense team for a revolutionary movement in their negotiations with their country's government. I've done some work with the United Nations, and I currently have a contract with the Department of National Defense in Canada, mediating military conflicts. At the same time, I also have a private practice, and my private mediation practice really specializes in the area of human rights. I do a lot of cases that involve issues of racism, gender discrimination, and I get hired quite a bit by Indigenous communities and Indigenous people to support them in navigating their conflicts. So I am primarily working in Toronto, Ontario, so across Canada as well. And another really important area to me is I'm a member of Women Mediators across the Commonwealth, which is one of the 5 women mediator networks, part of the Global Alliance, who work in support of UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. So I always bring that gendered perspective into the work that I do. So that's a little bit about myself. And I think before we get started into my presentation or engagement, so to speak, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. And I would like to invite everybody, whether you're present watching live now, or if you're watching this as a recording, to simply take a minute to ground yourself and to think about the land in which you are currently situated on. And consider what that land has given to you, and consider your role in protecting and caring for that land. I want to acknowledge that the land that I am currently on is the traditional territory of many nations. And I know we have a global audience right now, so the land that you're on will be different for everybody. But I am situated in Toronto, also known as Tukarano, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I want to talk about what this land means to me because we often hear land acknowledgements that are almost scripted and list, the nations that they are on and maybe the covenant that that area is protected by. But I think it's important to talk about the research maybe that you've done or what you've learned about the land. And on this day, my home is situated on a street that is called Longboat. And the street was actually named in honor of Tom Longboat, who was a Mohawk from Six Nations Reserve, which is only about an hour from my current home. And he was the world's best long distance runner in the early 1900s. He was also a Canadian soldier during the First World War. As I started to research him and learn more about him, I started to talk to my family about this incredible individual and his legacy. And my mom shared with me that one of his close relatives was her best friend growing up. And the two of them actually traveled across Canada together, going to different, First Nations communities, and they traveled like literally halfway from Toronto all the way to the west coast of British Columbia together in the 1970s. And hearing her stories and learning about this made me reflect and consider on how this land links us all in ways that we may never realize. So of course that led to more research on Diane Longboat and where is she now? And it turns out that she's the leader of an organization called Soul of the Mother. And it's a team of spiritual leaders, healers, peace builders who currently travel amongst First Nations communities. And they carry out sacred fire practices and transformational healing on the self and on the community and on the earth in support of building peace. So I thought it was kind of a beautiful full circle moment to learn about this. So today I really want to acknowledge and recognize peace builders like Diane Longboat and other Indigenous warriors who are really the forces of nation to nation building. So thank you all. I also want to talk about my positionality in this conversation. And I want to acknowledge that, in preparing to join today, that there was some discomfort in talking about Indigenous approaches as a white settler. So I do want to make it clear and clarify that, as a non-Indigenous woman, I am sharing my learning experience and my reflections, and I'm sharing what I have learned from working with Indigenous people and communities, and how what I have learned has really allowed me to widen the blinders that I wear as a result of my upbringing and as a result of my purist mediation training that I did receive. There is a wide array of, Indigenous approaches out there globally. And I will simply be speaking about, the approach that I have been exposed to and what I have learned, and sharing how that has allowed me to unlearn, to inform, and to transform my own practice.
Let me also put it here that, Alicia, that Robin, she also had the same apprehension. She actually said, look, as a white woman, I should not be talking about it and all that. I said, no, the perspective that you will give is also very important. And her session was really nice. I don't know whether you saw that or you'll get time to see it. That happened day before yesterday, but you must watch it. The thoughts that she's brought in, and the relation to the kind of mediation discussion, or let's call it training also that happens, and how she looks at it now, because a lot of things that she was talking about are things that I keep talking about. It was really nice to actually hear someone say the whole thing. So your perspective is very important, Radisha, very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know that you'll be speaking to my dear friend and close colleague, John Bokaj, next week, who I was sharing with Vikram is, one of the most respected Indigenous people probably in our country, in Canada here. He's incredible. And I always make a point when files come in to me in assessing, the conflicts is there someone who's more appropriate for that? Same as speaking engagements. Is there a First Nations person who I can put forward? And so there were several First Nations names that I put forward, and mine was also put forward. So I'm thrilled that you'll be hearing from him and others during this symposium. So there are kind of three areas that I thought would be interesting to talk about. The first is around dispute resolution training and approaches. The second is around dispute resolution process design. Now, design is a really big part of what I do. I know it's a big part of what mediators in general do. But I teach at Osgoode Hall Law School in their Master of Laws in Dispute Resolution. And the course that I teach is on the topic of conflict analysis and process design. So when we're talking about Indigenous approaches to dispute resolution, my, analysis process oriented mind always goes to design. So that's something that I wanted to touch on today. And then the third area is how has learning about, different teachings and trainings, different design processes really transformed my own practice? Because it's really easy as mediators, practitioners, peace builders to get comfortable. When we are doing this work day in and day out, we start to have our standard opening, our standard way of connecting, the phrases that we use, the sayings, all of those things. And it's really important to continue getting curious and to crack those approaches open so we can bring something new into the processes. And so since I've started doing this work in the last, I think it's been 7 or so years more closely with Indigenous communities, my practice has completely transformed. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So the first topic on dispute resolution training and approaches. Now, formal training programs have historically taken a very colonial approach to dispute resolution or mediation, with very little consideration for traditional approaches and cultural nuances. We often see courses like negotiation, mediation, advanced mediation, ethics, online dispute resolution, and so on. When you look up different mediation training programs, there's a pretty standard course list. More recently, we've started to see courses on culture and diversity, and I'm really excited to say that at Osgoode Hall Law School in the LLM program where I teach, last year they offered a brand new course called In Search of Reconciliation through Dispute Resolution, which of course got people really excited, and it's a brilliant course that I can't recommend enough. It is important that, those future practitioners out there, those individuals who say, I really want to get in the field, or even practitioners today, are learning about different cultures and learning about the different traditional ways of resolving conflict, as we really do have a responsibility to be responsive to those that we work with. We have a responsibility to be engaged, to be flexible, to be creative, and to be curious. While we are the facilitators, the parties to any conflict are the experts in their experiences and what will work best for them in regards to navigating any given conflict. I have a friend who's a mediator, both in Canada, and she has a mediation organization in Ghana. Her name is Regina Thompson. And about a decade ago, she said something to me that I'll never, ever forget. She said, we need to treat others as centers of cultural excellence. We need to treat others as centers of cultural excellence. And, if we cannot do that, we are missing such a big piece to the puzzle and to the process. We need to center the process around the parties and around the individuals and what will work best for them. We can't fit them into our process. We need to work with them to design what will work best for them because they know. The colonial approach to resolving conflict, I have found, has been a very linear approach. In all of my education and all of my training, I was always taught about these stages and these steps and these checklists. You hear about the mediator's opening statements, and you hear about seating arrangements around a table, the documents that are used, the ground rules. We're taught phrases like, or words, mediation, win-win, compromise. And what these really do is, I think, pigeonhole ourselves and pigeonhole the parties into thinking about the process in a really specific set way. What we want to do is think more broadly about the process, be more creative. Instead of it being linear, these processes are really cyclical. And we want to use language that is not going to narrow parties' mind frame about the conflict and the approach, but rather broaden it and empower the parties in the process. There is no one size fits all approach. There is no cookie cutter approach to follow. Dispute resolution processes really are cyclical. They need to be malleable. They need to be unique to the parties and the people that you're working with. And it is up to us as practitioners to really learn and to adapt and to explore what that means to the parties. We need to co-design and collaborate with the parties in order to design a process. So those are some reflections on, I think, the teachings around mediation and how we need to get curious and kind of break the mold a little bit. The second topic is that piece around design, dispute resolution process design. And I encourage you to reflect on the following question. What are the stages in your dispute resolution process? What does your process look like? What does it typically include? And is it malleable and collaborative with the parties? To contextualize this conversation about dispute resolution approaches and design, we can consider John Cleefield's steps in a mediation process. And we're going to look at his 4 steps. And then what I'm going to do is share a story of a specific conflict that I worked on that involved a lot of people, all Indigenous people, chiefs and counsel. And we're going to look at John Cleefield's steps, and we're going to kind of dissect them in regards to an Indigenous approach and see how they kind of fit together or maybe don't fit or can be interchanged. So the 4 steps that John Cleefield talks about is the convening stage. So step 1, the convening stage, which typically includes the intake with the individuals, as well as putting together the contracts for the work. The second stage he talks about is the clarifying stage. That's where you're really gathering more information about the conflict. You're sometimes maybe speaking to lawyers or the representative or the head of the community, whoever it might be, and you're really trying to figure out what are some of the core issues here. The third stage is the creating stage. This is where you are really working with the individuals involved in the conflict and hearing about the issues from their perspective and learning about some of the roots of the conflict, and then doing that, idea generation or brainstorming piece around options. And the last stage he talks about is the confirming stage, which is really narrowing down, how is everybody going to move forward and putting together that contract. So what I'd like to do is talk about a very large conflict that I co-mediated with John Bocage, who you will hear from next week, as well as our colleague Paul Iacono. This was probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. And this conflict included about a dozen Indigenous communities. It primarily involved their chiefs, council, and the community members as well. And it took place over the course of about 6 months. And this was here in Canada, also known as Turtle Island. And I'm going to look at those 4 stages, which might be, applicable to commercial cases. And I want to talk about how those stages were different in regards to the Indigenous approach. And as a result of this experience, John, Paul, and I ended up publishing the approach that we used. And I can share that link with Vikram maybe, and it can be posted and shared with everybody, because the approach that we used, we ended up calling it Anishinaabe Noon Degazwan, which is Ojibwe and translates to listening to the voice of the people. We have since consulted with the Canadian government on the approach and tribunals. We've spoken to the governments of Brazil, Argentina, Colombia. I've presented on the process in Kenya. So maybe I'll share that with Vikram, and maybe we can post the article to it later. So let's look at the first stage. So this idea of convening or intake and contracting. It typically might look like a phone call that you receive and you do a consultation. If it's a commercial file and you're working with lawyers, maybe you receive, information or initial call from counsel, whatever it might be. This one was a little bit different. I received a phone call from John Bocage about 6 or 7 years ago. And he said, I've been called by a community or several communities, and it's a really, really large file. And I need somebody else to work with me on this. And I'm wondering if you would join me. And my first question was, why me? Why are you calling me? And John shared this beautiful story in his culture around bridge building. And he said, in our community, there's a story around needing to build a strong bridge together. And in order to build that bridge, you need to do it with both genders. And so John is a very well-respected Indigenous male elder. It was important to him to work with a woman on this file. And, there was a government party involved. And so he thought Indigenous and non-Indigenous co-facilitators would be complementary. Also, the difference in age. I might be able to connect to some of the youth in the process more easily than he may, and maybe able to connect to some of the women involved in the process. So I, of course, then go into, well, who am I and what do I bring into this process as a non-Indigenous younger practitioner? What is my role? And I think that's always an important question that we have to ask ourselves when we are taking on any process, is what do I bring to it? And, through that conversation with John, we talked about my experience working with the revolutionary movement and focusing on issues around identity and the role that identity plays in conflict, as well as working with, cases that have extreme power imbalances and experience with process design. So all of these conversations were part of our own intake as who are we as the practitioners, and are we the right people for this role? Something else that we talked about really early on is language. And John had said to me, the word mediator doesn't actually translate in Ojibwe. So if we are using the word mediator, that is a colonial term that doesn't translate to this community. So what we need to do is use a word that will land with them as not being colonial. And so we right away realized that we have to call ourselves facilitators, that we are co-facilitators in this work, because the word mediator wasn't going to set the right tone and wasn't appropriate even for the work that we were going to be doing. That also led to the conversation of, if we're not saying mediator, are we calling this a mediation process? If we're saying facilitator, is this, facilitated dialogue? Are these facilitated sessions, dialogue sessions? How do we want to refer to it? And this is where we landed on the term Anishinaabe Noon Degazwin, which once again translates to listening to the voice of the people. And that is what we called this process, is as co-facilitators, we are going to come into all of these communities, and we are going to sit in circle with chiefs and council and community members, and we're going to listen. And we're going to be here to hear your voice and to learn from you and to co-design a process moving forward with your insight. So we never referred to it as a mediation process or to us as mediators. We were facilitators who were there to listen to the voice of everybody that we would be engaging with. During this first intake stage, so to speak, before we even met with any of the parties, John and I went out for dinner and we had a conversation about culture. And he shared with me a lot of cultural pieces and cultural nuances about these communities and things that would be really important for me to know. Pieces around, the role of medicine in the culture. So tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, cedar, the role of gender and how women, really are considered equals in these communities. And as a woman, what my role was in the process. And we talked about clothing. And he said, you know, when we are sitting in ceremony, if you could wear a skirt, it's a sign to the creator that there are women in the circle and that there is gender balance and gender parity. And so I always had I always had a skirt in my bag with me for any time we were going to engage in ceremony. We then had to meet everybody. So once John and I were on the same page, and you know, I had an opportunity to learn from him, and we had an opportunity to kind of collaborate on how we were going to move forward, we had our first meeting with all of the chiefs and council. And so, you know, we flew out with the intention to once again just listen. So I remember we walked in, we introduced ourselves to everybody, and we said, we're not here to say anything today, we're just here to observe. And so they were having one of their, you know, regular meetings that they held, and we sat at the back of the room and we just listened. That's all we did. We spent an entire day just listening to the conversation. We wanted to observe and not speak. And I have a beautiful quote here from Richard Wagamisi that reminds me of this first session that we had. And he said, somebody asks an elder, why do you always repeat things 3 times? And the elder says, you listen the first time, you hear the second time, and you feel the 3rd time. When you listen, you become aware. That's for your head. When you hear, you awaken, and that's for your heart. When you feel, it becomes a part of you. That's for your spirit. 3 times. It's so you learn to listen with your whole being, and that's how you learn. And I can't tell you how much we learned from just listening that one day. We got to hear how everybody spoke about the conflict, the tone that they used with other people in the room. There were about 20 some odd people in the room. We got to see how the body language changed when they were engaging with people that they were allied with or people that they were against, more or less. We got to learn about the cultural nuances that were at play between the various communities that were represented. We looked at who sat next to who had lunch with who went out for smoke breaks with who pointed their finger angrily when they spoke to others. We really got to observe the dynamics and take in a lot of information before we even got started in the process. This was just us learning during that first stage. On our second day, John spoke and did the creation story, which I'm sure he'll speak about next week. So he probably did a 45-minute overview of the creation story, which is something that bonded everybody in that room together because it was something that they were familiar with, probably hadn't heard it quite in the way that John shares it. And it really brought the room together. You could see that everybody's body kind of, you know, released a little bit, and they were really leaning in and hanging on to every word that he said because it was something that united all of them culturally. And then afterwards, one of the chiefs looked at me and said, "You, what do you think?" And so I stood up and I looked at everybody and I said, "I think that you've all been meeting in this room for over a decade." And they all laughed and they said, "Yeah, we've been in this exact room for over a decade." And I said, "I think you've all been sitting in the exact same seats for that entire time." And once again, they all burst out laughing and said, "Yeah, we sit in the same seat every time we come in this room, every single month." And I said, "Well, you know, in the same way that you're stuck mentally or physically, you're stuck mentally. Same way you're stuck to your seat, you're stuck to your positions. And so I think the first thing we have to do is move. The first thing we have to do is, you know, find a different location to connect with one another and a different environment, because there's so much history in this room, and that's really going to impact how we communicate with one another." And, you know, everybody agreed with that. And it was only after that that we started the contract. After all of that work that we started putting together the actual contract. And so we had, you know, an agreement for fees for those first couple of days, but to move forward with the process, we had to get to know the people. We had to engage with them. We had to learn about them. We had to start to build that trust. And a big piece of that trust included culture, and it included Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of seeing and feeling. And, you know, we had to have that opportunity before we could move to the next stage. So John Cleefield's second stage is around the clarifying piece. And, you know, in a standard mediation training or commercial processes, clarifying often includes the initial exchange of information. So that might look like legal briefs or legal documents, or it might look like the initial consultation with the parties and hearing from them about, you know, what's going on before you actually get into the mediation or dispute resolution process. So in order for us to kind of clarify the dynamics, we spent quite a bit more time with the chiefs and counsel in more meetings like that, where we were listening and observing, engaging in dialogue. We then decided that we needed to go to the communities themselves. And this is why. Indigenous communities are collectivist communities. They're collectivist communities. So any agreement that was reached was likely to be brought back to the community for a vote. And if anything was going to be voted on, well, how could you come up with an agreement only including certain representatives and not engaging the community members at large? So we put together this, you know, pretty incredible schedule of traveling across quite a distance and spending time in every single community. And we did this because we wanted the community to get to know us and who we were and our intentions. And we also wanted to tell the community that we care. When we say listening to the voice of the people, you're the people, and it's your voices that we need to hear from. So we did these community visits, and we invited everybody, which was a little risky, but we invited everybody. And we said, anybody who wants to come and sit in circle with us, come and sit in circle with us. We want to hear from elders. We want to hear from men, women, youth, anyone who's going to have buy-in into a potential agreement. We want to hear from you. And so we spent time in circle in each community. So sitting in circle, John conducted ceremony at the beginning of every circle. So he would have his bundle in the middle, which included his sacred objects, and he would smudge at the beginning, where he would, you know, light tobacco or sage or whatever medicine he would be using, and use an eagle feather to then go around the circle and smudge everybody in the circle. And we would then ask one question. There was only one question that we would ask in every single community. And that one question was, what is important for us to hear? What is important for us to hear from you? And, you know, you can imagine how long this process took. And, you know, I think we only had one community that had maybe 25 people show up, but we had other communities where there were 50 people or more wanting to talk with us. So we spent hours and hours, days and days sitting in circle and just listening to the community and hearing about their concerns. And of course, we wanted to make sure that chief and counsel were representing their community and their voices, and that if there were things that they were missing, we were hearing about those pieces as well. So this really did allow us to establish relationships with the community and to determine who else needed to be part of the formal process. So from a, you know, process design perspective, not following that typical formula really allowed us to delve deeper and have greater insights into who are all of the actors in the conflict? Who might need to be brought into the process that currently isn't sitting at the decision-making table? What is all the content? What are the emerging issues that we need to know about? What's the context? What are the factors, including the local culture within each of those communities, that shapes the conflict environment? And what has happened in past processes? So what has worked and what hasn't worked in the past? And I apologize if you're getting some background noise. It's very, very warm here, and I've got the window open and someone's doing some yard work.
No, it's perfectly all right. Perfectly all right.
So that was really looking at John Cleefield's second stage. And so the third stage that he talks about is the creating stage. Now, in most trainings, we learn about the creating stage as, once you've gathered that initial set of information and you're actually going into the formal process, what does it look like? So what is the agenda? What are the core issues that you've narrowed down? What are you going to be negotiating over? What could be some potential options that come up? That typically is all involved in the creating stage. So our creating stage looked a little bit differently. From a design perspective, this is really the implementation side of things. So what our creating stage looked like is after we did this incredible, journey across this area of land and met with all of the communities, we had a better idea of, how do we need to move forward? What does this process, now that we know more about the culture and know more about the people and the concerns involved, how do we need to design the next stages with their input and their insight? And so going back to the chiefs and council, we shared with them, our experience with all of the community visits and what we learned, and then started to talk about next steps. And what we all decided to do was that we would take some time and then go back, and we would spend several days sitting in circle with one another. And it was, culturally important to ask 4 questions. And so you would have 4 rounds of circle, so 1 round per question. And then we decided we would start to caucus. So we did a little bit of a mix between the traditional Indigenous practice within that community of sitting in circle and asking the 4 questions, and then going into a caucus to start to work through some of these issues. And when I say a caucus, I should clarify that it was several caucuses with different people, different sizes over the course of several months. And when we talk about the circle and the questions, when we were sitting in circle with chiefs and council, John and I would sit beside each other, and we always had a chair that was empty in the circle. And the reason that chair was empty was because it was meant to represent the ancestors that were no longer with us. So the ancestors that were important to the community, and anybody sitting within that circle could imagine that one of their ancestors was there with them, supporting them in the process. John, once again, would have his bundle sitting in the center of the circle, all of those sacred items that he would bring, that once again, everybody in the circle felt some level of connection to, because that bundle represents their culture. We would once again start off every single circle. So every single morning we would start off with a prayer, and we would invite one of the chiefs or council members to offer the prayer, or John would offer the prayer. And then we would do the smudging ceremony, where he would light his tobacco or his sage, and he would take his eagle feather and walk around the circle and offer the smoke to each individual, and they would do their own cleanse. We then did something different that isn't always done, and that's called a brush off ceremony. So after each individual would take the smoke and cleanse themselves with it, John would ask them to turn around, and he would take his eagle feather and he would brush off their shoulders. And brushing off their shoulders was meant to signify brushing off all that baggage that we felt in the room, the old room that we were using. And, when you have been in conflict for so long, for multiple decades, you are carrying that with you into every conversation. And the brush off ceremony was meant to say, we gotta let go of some of that past in order to be here and to speak clearly and listen deeply and be honest with ourselves and give this the best opportunity possible. So the brush off ceremony is one that is not always done, but John decided that we needed to do it in this scenario. We also, every single time we met, every time we went down, usually for a week at a time, because there was a lot of travel involved, we would meet in a different community's location or near a different community. So we were no longer going back to that one same room that we met that first week. We, traveled with everybody to different locations that were important to the communities or significant, accessible, all of those pieces. So I did something really unique with the seating arrangements, and this isn't typical. Usually when you are inviting people into circle, they sit wherever they want. They can take a seat in that circle wherever they wish. What I had actually done is I had looked at all of the people and put together a seating arrangement. And I had color-coded the individuals, and if any of them watch this, they'll probably laugh, but I had color-coded the individuals as either red zone, green zone, or blue zone. And that was in regards to their communication styles and what they might bring into the conversation. Now, a fear that I had was that you would have, some of the red zone people sit left to John's left and want to start off the conversation, because we would use a talking piece, and the talking piece would be passed to the left and go around the circle, and it would end with me. We were concerned that those red zone people would either sit right next to John and want the first word, and then the other ones would sit right next to me and want to have the last word. And we didn't want to risk ending with a whole bunch of negativity at the very end. So I had color-coded everybody and made it a seating arrangement. And so when chiefs and counsel came in, right away, 2 red zone people walked right up to me and said, "I'm sitting next to you, I want the last word." And that made John and I have a little laugh. And I looked at them and I said, "Thank you, not today, your seat's over there." And so we were able to redirect them and, manipulate the situation a little bit to ensure that we had that power balance within the circle. So sitting in circle in general does create this beautiful balance of power. But we were able to add to that by saying we don't want to risk ending on all this negativity, especially because this took place over 6 months, included a lot of travel. If you end on a negative note and we're not scheduled to go back for 2 or 3 more weeks because it's hunting season, what happens during that 2 or 3 weeks? We have to be really strategic in regards to the process. So the 4 questions that we had asked to the chief and counsel, I don't remember exactly what they were, but they centered around, the first one was around perspective. So something along, your perspective of why we're here today or what has brought us here. We asked a question around emotions, which is interesting because one of the women, one of the women chiefs had come up to me at some point in the process and pulled me aside and said, we have been in negotiations with each other for more than a decade, and we've never cried together. We've never been vulnerable together. We need that opportunity. So John and I went back to the drawing board and, created a question around emotions. And, that was really a turning point in the process because it really did allow everybody to let their guard down and be emotional and vulnerable around each other. We also had a question around fears, which, of course, a lot of people talked about 7 generations from now. 7 generations from now, where will the youth be if we don't figure this out? And then the last question was around hopes. So getting to hear, what are your hopes for this process? Your hopes for working with one another, your hopes for a resolution. And so with all of that information, once again, we were able to go back to the drawing board and consider the perspectives, the emotions, the fears, and the hopes, and talk about, what do the caucus groups need to look like? What are the smaller dialogue sessions? What do we want to do when we get everybody back together in circle as a group? We did brainstorming at one point, or I like to say idea generation that wasn't done in circle, but that was done as a larger group. And so over the course of many, many months, we kind of combined traditional Indigenous peace building practices with more modern mediation approaches. And that was really a beautiful thing that came together with this collaboration between John, myself, and then Paul attended a few sessions as well. So John Clefield looks at the 4th stage as the confirming stage. Now, typically the confirming stage is drafting the agreement and signing the agreement. Do we have a strong agreement that fits within that SMART acronym? Is it specific? Is it measurable, attainable, achievable? Does it have a good timeline? This one looked a little different because once again, a collectivist community we had to draft this agreement as a group. And so instead of, having, and I do want to add that we did during this process bring in experts. So there were lawyers involved. We did have an ancestry expert, a genealogy expert. And what we had asked them to do was sit outside the circle for all of these conversations. They weren't the decision makers. They were there for support. So they were there as witnesses. So when it came to drafting the agreement, we did the same thing. We had the experts sit outside of the room, and we empowered, I think we invited, there was one woman that we had given a marker to, and we said, are you up to drafting? And she said, yeah. And so we had all these, flip charts, and as a group, by consensus, which took a long time, you had to put together what wording was acceptable to each of the communities. And when this goes back to the communities for a vote, what might the grandmothers in the community pick apart? What might the youth pick apart? What do we have to be really conscious of in drafting this agreement? So the drafting was always done by consensus. Everybody had to agree on the wording and the language that was used. And then instead of just giving it to the lawyers to look over for legalese and to fine tune, we also had to have a pipe ceremony before that was done. So before the agreement was actually signed, we had a pipe ceremony to honor the agreement. And so Chief's counsel, John and myself, once again went back into circle, and John held a pipe ceremony because he is a pipe carrier from the Bear Clan. And, we all smoked the tobacco pipe together. And doing that culturally signified respect for the agreement, respect for the work that was done, honoring one another, and saying that this is what we are going to abide by and hold on to. And you're doing that in circle, in ceremony, calling on ancestors to be the witness of that. We then had the lawyers, while we were in pipe ceremony, looking over the agreement, and then everybody signed it. So you can see how we can take these kind of traditional 4 stages that, have become kind of standard and what we tend to learn about, and how we can kind of crack open those stages and consider how they can look differently from an Indigenous perspective. Now, this is one of many Indigenous processes that I've now been fortunate to be a part of, and it's really impacted my practice. And so I want to talk a little bit before we wrap up about how my practice has transformed over the last, 7 years, 10 years since doing this work, how my training has changed, how my processes have changed, and how I have changed as a practitioner as a result of being given this gift from Indigenous people and learning about their way of resolving disputes. There's a quote from practitioner David Plant, who says, we need to start defining the process as part of the problem. So we need to start defining the process as part of the problem. And I really like this quote because what it's saying is that once a process is chosen, it can become part of the issue itself, because parties and sometimes counsel or their representatives will likely come into that process with a really specific way of thinking about it. For example, I often work with people who, call me and say, we want to hire you as a mediator. And I say, okay, we need to have a conversation first about my own practice and my own approach. And they say, well, why do we have to do that? We know about you. And I say, well, it's a little bit different than some other mediators. And you might decide that you don't want to move forward. And, they're often surprised by the end of the conversation. And I often hear things like, we haven't been part of a process like that before, or we don't usually, do physiological work or work on embodied conflict. They have a very fixed mindset around what the process will look like. We can, see the same thing with arbitration. You go into arbitration, you have a very fixed idea of what that's going to look like in mediation arbitration. And so we want to make sure that the process itself isn't going to be part of the problem, and that we are going to invite parties into a conversation around what it will look like and can include, and how it can be co-designed. So people aren't trapped by these unconscious patterns of thinking about the conflict and the approach. And the behaviors, which of course are brought into the process. So we really need to break away from what we are comfortable with and step off this idea of there being a linear path and step into the space that the parties hold and become more cyclical and fluid. So I get hired now both by Indigenous lawyers, non-Indigenous lawyers, Indigenous communities, non-Indigenous communities in conflict with Indigenous communities. And so, I have to remain really curious because every community has a different practice. Just because of the, certain communities that I spoke about earlier, that doesn't mean that those same practices are applicable to a different community. And I remember John Bocage and I received a phone call to work with a different set of communities not long after that one that we worked on. And I was talking about the process and him sitting on the left and me sitting to his right. And he said, no, in this community, we have to sit the other way. He said, because in that community, the talking piece is no longer passed to the left. In that community, if you do not pass that talking piece to the right, he said, we're done. He said, it's very disrespectful. And so we have to make sure that we're, staying curious and continuing to learn about all the different practices and cultural nuances. So my approach has really changed from being one that is linear to one that is being cyclical. My concept of time around mediation has really changed. There's always a concern around time, always. We know this, that processes take time, that funding can be a challenge. But I'm a lot more comfortable now pushing back when somebody says we need to have this resolved within a month. I'm much more comfortable now saying, it depends. It all depends on the engagement and the parties and what we're able to co-create, because, these processes cannot be rushed. And it's often a difficult conversation because of funding, but it's one that we need to have because we owe it to the parties in the process. Something else I really took away from and continue to take away from working with Indigenous communities is the collectivist culture piece, and how you often have to bring in family members or elders into the conversation, sometimes other community members, and how that impacts confidentiality, because confidentiality isn't as straightforward when you are including people outside of the decision-making table. And so I find that my mediation agreements or dialogue processes, the agreements themselves look a little bit different because the confidentiality clauses sometimes change because they have to include other people. For co-facilitation, I am huge on co-facilitation. I've continued to carry on John's story, carry it with me on bridge building and wanting to work with different co-mediators depending on the conflict. If it is a conflict that involves racism, I might call up a colleague who might be, a Black woman who specializes in racism cases. If it is an Indigenous community, I do not conduct ceremony as a non-Indigenous person, so I would call up an Indigenous colleague and or refer the file out to them. This concept of ceremony, and so I always offer for ceremony to be included, but I do not conduct ceremony. So if the parties decide that they just want me to be the mediator and they don't want anybody else or facilitator to join, then I invite them to start off the ceremony. Or I say, is there an elder in the community that can join us to start the process off with ceremony? And so, it is up to them how they would like that opening to look so that it is representative and supportive and inclusive of their own cultural practices. Once again, going back to Regina Thompson's quote of making sure that we're treating people as their own centers of cultural excellence. So what is it that you want to include in the conversation and in the process? Another way in which my practice has really transformed is, I had a huge realization that that first day that John and I went out to observe the chief and counsel in dialogue. And I mentioned that John was talking about the creation story, and everybody around the room went from being in conflict with each other to being totally relaxed and engaged. And again, when we would sit in circle and there would be that bundle in the middle of the circle, And there we would start off with a prayer and then a smudging ceremony and brush off ceremony. You would just see everybody transform in the room. It would go from that frustration and anger that they walked in with to this place of connection. And there was a really spiritual aspect involved. And I've carried that into my work now, even with non-Indigenous communities, in the sense of being hyper aware of physiological responses to conflict. And so I now do not have a single process, regardless of what cultural background they are from, where I don't include the physiological aspect of conflict in my consultations, in my pre-mediations, and in the process. So I'm constantly asking questions and trying to learn about, what activates the parties. What is the physiological response that you have, whether it's the increased heart rate, whether it's the pit in the stomach, whether it's that feeling of, fight or flight, what's happening for you in your body. And then we do work on what are the tools that can support you in re-engaging when that happens. What do you need? Because during these really difficult conversations, a physiological reaction is going to happen. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in conflict. And so how can you best support yourself, and how can I support you? What can I do as the mediator or facilitator to support you when that happens? So, we've been hearing a lot in the last couple of years about a trauma-informed approach to practice. I think I do include a trauma-informed approach, but I like to refer to this as embodied conflict. And I take almost like a state of mind approach or embodied conflict approach to the work that I do. And that's something that I took away from just witnessing the shift that happens in the room when ceremony is included and when people are given space to, shift the perspective onto something that brings them together and brings light into the room. It's a very, I think, immersive experience for the parties when they're able to tap into their own physiological responses. Last two things that have really, changed are this concept of inside mediators, which I know is a concept that is a lot more popular outside of North America. It's not one that we talk about a lot in North America, but it is a lot more popular abroad. And the reason I think that inside mediators is really important is when we look at, Canada, for example, with such an incredibly large and vast Indigenous population, when we have really large conflicts and the government steps in, what they tend to do is they tend to appoint a former politician to be the mediator, which comes with all sorts of issues, but that's kind of their go-to. And the reality is that we have incredible Indigenous practitioners in this country. I mean, incredible. And everyone who's listening today, if you join in next week to the symposium, which I encourage you to do, you'll hear from my colleague, John Bocage, who's a very well-known mediator and facilitator across the country.
And also, let me tell you, also David is also going to be there.
Yes, so David
he's also next week. Yeah, he's on. John is on the 17th. David is on the 18th.
Well, I think those were the two names I put forward. I said, you got to talk to my friends, David and John. And so this concept of inside mediators, I think it's applicable globally, that in every corner of this earth, there is a talented practitioner. Many of them just have the natural skills and maybe not the training. But this idea of parachuting other people in can sometimes be helpful, I think, for the theoretical side, the process design side. But it's also important to look at who might be a better person to be the facilitator here. And so I refer a lot of files out to other people who I think might be more appropriate for that work. And of course, also I'm encouraging the Canadian government to say, we can't just hire these former politicians who are not Indigenous and don't know the communities. We got to look at inside mediators to do this work as well. And if we're talking about the government, of course, we need to consider UNDRIP and how UNDRIP says that, Indigenous people have the right to practice their own cultures. And I think that and ceremony should be included in dispute resolution processes. If you have a former politician doing this work, they might not consider that. And they also have a right to utilize their own dispute resolution processes. So having an Indigenous person lead these processes is really fundamental. The last piece is around representation in ADR. And I'm once again situated in Canada. And we, are still a very white male dominated field. And representation is an incredibly important conversation to be having, because we need to have representation both in teaching and training. I know many of my students have said, all of our professors or teachers growing up in this program or in the field were white. And, the guest speakers you brought in were really diverse, but you yourself are a white woman. And so we need to make sure that we do have more diversity in this field. So we are learning from people from different cultural backgrounds and can talk to us about their unique approaches and styles and ceremonies and all of that. And that also goes for being able to make referrals. Often the way it works in Canada for commercial cases is lawyers will put forward their list of mediators that they want to work with. And if you look at those lists, they're usually white males. And we want to make sure that we have more representation and that the people who are doing the hiring of mediators are also aware of how much representation matters to this work. So those were really the three areas that I wanted to talk about around, the teaching and the training piece, the process design piece, and how it can be adapted and malleable when considering Indigenous approaches. And then how my own practice is really transformed as a result of these experiences. And I do think that, what I offer now is so much more rich. And I have so much gratitude for John Bocage for bringing me in on that very first file years ago and having the experience to constantly unlearn, relearn, be informed, and then transform the work that I'm able to do in order to support people in conflict. So that was almost right on time to
there is no time, Alicia. There's no time concept. You can take as long as you want. I told you about that the episode of Evolution of a Mediator. 4 hours, 7 minutes without a break. So time is never a factor because, of course, there's no session after yours. But it was wonderful, Alicia, what you took us through. I think this aspect, of course, we're going to document. I'm thinking of actually putting together whatever comes out from these sessions into a compilation. Of course, we'll work on it in a way that you don't have to put in so much effort. We can take the transcript from the YouTube thing and put it together, because there was a comment on of someone, Linda Dobson. I'll just read a comment out. This session is wonderful and a timely session as I go into training advanced mediation next week. I agree with the fluidity and cultural sensitivity necessary as co-facilitators. Then she's asking, are transcripts available? And thank you for your deep insight. So this is why we need to put it together. I think that's what's going to happen. And I put the other comment out, which is nice hearing from you, Alicia, great mediator. This is Igioma Ladel. Okay, so my question, of course, one was on the caucusing part of it. Was there any, how did the community look at that?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. Really great question. So we did, I don't even remember how many caucuses we did and how many different groups that we did. There were clearly allyships that were formed amongst the communities, and there was clearly a group that was much more positional. And so we had primarily two facilitators, John and I, and then we had a third, Paul Iacona, who came in for a couple sessions. And so sometimes Paul would have one group, I would have one group, John would have one group, sometimes John and I would work with a group. It was constantly changing. And the communities responded well to it, really well. What I will say is, of course, we made mistakes along the way. You always do, right? You always make mistakes along the way. And so, two mistakes that we made that I think it's important to talk about. One is that at one point we did miscalculate or forget about the timing of one of the hunting seasons. And so we had put out a summary and a path forward to the communities. And the next day, the chiefs and council went into hunting season and were, not accessible for several weeks. And so they were sitting with it and brewing with it before we had time to talk about it. And so that's something we would have changed, is not sending that document out with that timing. With the caucusing, a mistake that we made was that we invited everybody to the location. And then we said, enjoy the beautiful property, enjoy the view, there's food, we'll be with one group downstairs. But because there were so many people, a caucus wasn't an hour. A caucus was like 4 hours, right? 5 hours. So you have everybody else waiting for all of that time. And so that was, we made that mistake the first time we started the first of the many caucuses. And then we apologized to them for waiting all day. And we said, listen, what we'll do is we'll schedule people for half days. And so you don't have to come to site until that day. So no one's waiting around. But they were very open and responsive to caucusing. And caucusing we did for the most part around tables. Everything else that we did, there were no tables. We were sitting in circle. But the caucusing really was, when you think about the more purist style of mediation, sitting around the table, looking at one another, writing things down. It was different than just sitting in circle and speaking from the heart, but they were very responsive to it. And the caucusing was necessary. We had to get to the caucusing before we could bring everybody back for the idea generation stage. But thank you for the question.
But I'm just thinking that if you talk about the table, I moved on to bringing people under the tree. There was this Sarah Blake in Australia in the conference and a symposium that I did on heart, soul, spirituality. We were talking about this aspect. Why do we talk about the table? Why not under the tree? So there was one session in the conference on bringing people under the tree. So I'm just moving away from the table concept. Let's talk about the tree.
I love that. I love that. And I very rarely mediate commercial files now, very rarely. The bulk of my work right now is either with the Department of National Defense and the military, or it's Indigenous communities, or it's human rights work. The odd time I'll take on a commercial file, but I always have a very frank conversation with counsel around my process is very different. So you might not want to hire me. And I talk about, we won't be sitting around a table. And for lawyers, that blows their mind. They say, what do you mean we're not sitting around a table? And, I even for those cases move the table away because it's a block between people. And so I like this terminology of sitting under the tree. So thank you for that.
Now you have to tell people that, look, my process is different. That's why you need to hire me.
Yes.
Don't say you might not want to hire me.
And I'll say that no one's ever said no. After nobody has ever said, you know what, Alicia, we're going to go with somebody else. So I think what's interesting is, once again, going back to this quote of defining the process as part of the problem, take that conversation with the lawyers, for example. They're so caught off guard by the consultation. They're so caught off guard. They say, what do you mean we're going to talk to our clients about physiological responses? And you're going to include a whole bunch of activities that require them to move around the room. And we're not going to sit. And they start to get curious themselves. So even in that conversation, you're starting to shift their mind frame and their assumptions around how things are going to look and how they're going to present their arguments and all of that. And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to work on that shift as early as possible, so you can have them in this space of curiosity and openness coming into the conversation.
And I'm saying that people actually connect with that process. I think that's a natural process. That's the way people have to sit together and they have to resolve. So they understand how that happens. So, and the other aspect, which of course, that box that has been created, it's come from the court system. And that's the worst thing that has happened with mediation. I mean, you will hear me say this a lot of times, and I will keep repeating it. And I keep saying that's not mediation, mediation for me, because finally there's a gun on your head. Cost and time. A court will take so long, so settle. As you put the gun on the head. There has to be a totally different way of going about resolving it, collaborating, which is what you are picking up from communities. That's what you would, I mean, that's the kind of approach they have. It's a community thing, wanting to put it together. But tell me, Alicia, I've been talking about online mediation. For me, that's what it works. I've gone totally online. But can this work online with all the ceremony and everything? How do we do that? You can't say no. You have to say we have to work a way out of this. There has to be some way.
And so I think, mediated with up to 23 people online and have felt that it was very successful. When it gets over 20, I hesitate. And the reason being is, go back to that initial meeting that we had where we got to sit in the room and watch the dynamics. We saw who went for a smoke break, who carpooled together, who had lunch together, who sat next to who. You miss so much when you are not in person, so much. The cultural practices, conducting ceremony, we still do it virtually. I've still held ceremony virtually where an elder has joined us and done a smudge virtually. It's not the same. It's a lot more challenging. The other thing that's important to recognize is Canada is a huge country, and access to strong internet is not always possible. It's not always possible. And so we need to think about the accessibility piece as well, which then of course leads us to a financial conversation, because the finances can be challenging. But accessibility in regards to internet isn't always feasible too. So for a process that involves 20 or so chiefs and council representing communities, it's really important to be there in person. I mediate a lot online for the smaller conflicts, but for anything larger, I think it's important to be doing the work in person.
Yeah, I think basically if people don't fit into one screen, it is an issue. You want to watch everyone. So that definitely is a thing. But let's thank Elon Musk. He's putting together this whole internet connectivity through satellites. So that should not be an issue. I think the costs will have come down already, and I think they'll come down even further. So I think connectivity, because Africa, because before your session, there was a session with someone from Kenya, and her signal went. She couldn't. It got cut off. So that was. I mean, for Africa also, I think this is a big issue, which I think will get sorted out. I think I don't know, but I think I like that aspect of this whole hybrid concept that you were saying. By picking up the traditional, and this aspect had come up in that symposium that I did last year, which I keep talking about, that mediation in our culture and traditions. So there's someone in Israel who had studied the Jews who had come from the Balkans, and how, of course, the rabbi and all the trust and their importance, and how this modern mediator, called it modern. So this hybrid model where a traditional and a modern mediator can come together. And of course, that sensitization to the whole process, that look, you are not taking a decision, the parties have to come to it, because in the traditional thing, it is more about telling you what to do, kind of thing. So some balancing there. So that part of it, but that came up there was quite interesting.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in the article that we wrote, you can just type in my name and then type in Indigenous Dispute Resolution, and the article will pop up that John Paul and I co-wrote.
No, you will also send me the link, and I'll put it in the post when I put out the post for this session. Let me put it there, but because I think that flow chart, and is there a flow chart in that article? Because a flow chart kind of thing would be nice.
There's no flow chart. I do have a PowerPoint on it, which does have the flow chart, but I know it's not in the article. It's not in the article, but it does. The article does outline the stages that we kind of went through and navigated.
Do you want to show us that PowerPoint? Is it? Do you want to show it?
Oh gosh.
Okay.
I wouldn't
okay.
be able
It's
to
okay.
find
It's
it right
okay. It's
now.
okay. But let me tell you, Alicia, one thing that I've been thinking of, when you have large numbers of people and communities to take into, how can we use things like YouTube to be able to bring that session out to everyone, so everyone's participating, and then of course they can give their inputs on the chat, something there. I mean, have you looked at it from that perspective? Because I really feel that is something that needs to be put together, where everyone feels part of the process. Have you?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I have not incorporated media into my processes. So educationally, yes. So often during, I guess, pre-mediations, I provide content. And so I'll say, you might be interested in reviewing these materials or this information. But it would be a good idea to include media in regards to talking about the process and what the community visits might look like and all of that, to help people prepare for them. But yeah, I think it's a great way to have outreach, especially when you have so many actors, because it's not always feasible to engage with everybody. So how can you engage with everybody? And media is a really good option.
Yeah, because technology gives you that option. You can create these closed groups in various, I mean, say maybe it could be Facebook, or of course YouTube, everything goes out to everyone. And in certain situations, everything can go out to everyone. I don't see that as a problem, because there's no confidentiality involved in a lot of processes. I mean, a lot of things.
Yeah.
But because there's this thing that about the mining projects, communities affected by mining projects, which Luis Ore did the second, he was speaker number 2. So he, of course, has worked with these large communities, And he did talk about one community in Canada, the Nahaltan Nation. Is it a Nahaltan? Am I pronouncing it correctly? I don't know.
Not sure. Not sure.
Not sure. I don't know. Okay, so Tahaltan, no, Tahaltan Nation.
Okay. Yeah.
So he had then I mean, Luis is in Peru, so he had then come to Canada and actually looked at how they had done this, because they worked with in this kind of situation with mining projects. And according to me, there'll be a lot of people involved in that, in communities. So in some way that they can feel part of the process by actually, it's not, look,
Yeah.
finally, that distrust in the process, thinking that some people are sitting and you don't know what they're talking about. I think that should be removed. That they should.
Yeah, and I know when we were consulting, we spoke with officials in Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina. And I believe it was in Argentina where they were actually live streaming the process. And so community members can watch the process and feel like they were part of it. And they were also able to provide feedback. Now, once again, this I think is important for tracking reasons, because when you speak to a lot of Indigenous people, tracking ancestry and history has been a challenge, because when the colonizers came, a lot of this was wiped out, right? There was this cultural genocide that took place and continues to take place. So having historical records of what has happened could be really meaningful to the communities. At the same time, there's also this privacy and, it's really sacred to have ceremony. And so there are communities who would not want media to be involved. And so that was a conversation that John and I have had around, confidentiality and not having media and it remaining private because of the specific culture. So I think it would have to be adaptable once again to what was acceptable to the parties who were involved in the process.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, look, like I was telling about Luis Ore's session in this symposium, he's spoken about his experience in Ecuador, but he's come on other shows of mine, and there he's spoken about where in Peru. So there, they've got this stadium, and the entire community comes into that stadium. So but the government officials and some from the I think from the companies, the mining companies, they're on the screen. So it's hybrid in that sense. It's not the other way around. It's not that all the community is watching it live stream, but at least they've got those people involved. So that hybrid model also, look, it depends on the issue that you're resolving. I mean, who are the people involved? Because finally, look, it comes down to everyone, if we all talk about, get everyone, the right people under the tree. I won't say on the table, under the tree.
Under the tree.
So because it's important to get everyone there. And in the last session that Faith from Kenya, she was also talking about this, that look, there are situations where in Africa, in Kenya, where the women are not part of the process. And whatever solution has come out is not something that they have, of course, agreed on. And that creates more conflicts out of that.
Absolutely. And when we look at UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, it's saying that women have to be part of these processes. And it's been proven, statistically shown, that when women are part of dispute resolution processes and drafting of agreements, the agreements have more longevity. They're more sustainable. Because how can you have an agreement that excludes 50% of the population and what their experience is and how they're impacted? So I think that's a really, really important point.
And one particular example that she was giving where the women were directly affected by that. She was talking about honey, beekeeping and honey, and how that honey was something that these women used to use. And how the solution came out that the honey will be transported to some center somewhere, and the money will come to that center, and that money was going to men. And here that these women were actually benefiting from that process. They were getting the honey, they were using it, and money was coming to them, from which they were running their house. Now that money was going to the men, who were spending it on other things, and maybe getting into another marriage and spending money. So the family was getting affected by it. So these are important things to get everyone there. And that's, I'm saying, technology, of course, look, for a moment, let's look at some cultures. If they don't want women to be sitting there, of course, we have to sensitize them to that. And of course, they should be part of the process. Supposing that doesn't happen, if they're watching and they can contribute and they can suggest, at least some part of the job is done. So, step by step. So now the thing is that, Alicia, I can understand that, of course, time must be a factor for you. So I will not hold you longer. If there is a kind of a concluding thing that you want to? But one interesting thing, look, I still pick up from what you said initially about the word. The word mediator is something that people will not, I mean, to be able to translate it also might be difficult. That's why the theme on my symposium on mediation in our culture and tradition was that people might not be familiar with the word, but they're familiar with the process. So connecting them to the process and finding the right word to connect them with, I think that's very important, because the whole process, the concept in their mind will change. And if they connect to the right process, they'll know everything about the process. So that's what it is. So
well,
Alicia,
Vikram, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. Grateful to you and everyone who has, tuned in to watch, for putting this together and being part of this. And I'm excited for you to speak to my friends, John Bocage and David Noganash next week, because they're fantastic.
Please drop into their session. You can join the session.
I will if I can.
Yeah. Zoom link remains the same. The schedule is available. The link is on my website. I mean, anywhere you can check the time. So thank you very much, Alicia. Really nice. And I think, and this we will carry on. We'll put together some document which we can also circulate or whatever. I think this is really important what you've put together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.